If you're familiar with the discourse surrounding the Invincible TV series, you know that there is no character more controversial than Amber Bennett. The subject of dozens of YouTube videos and too many Twitter threads to count, this character gets people heated, which is surprising. Invincible is a series that features plenty of characters who live in morally gray territory, and some who are outright heinous in their actions. So why is the character who gets the most anger thrown her way a teenage girl? Is that criticism warranted? While Amber certainly has flaws as a character, the hate thrown her way feels particularly disproportionate. I think there's definitely a combination of factors that lead to this, but I want to explore the character in depth and determine whether or not this is actually a character who deserves this controversial distinction. Hey, this video is brought to you by two things today. One is my official compilation channel, Johnny Too Cozy, where I'm re-editing tons of my old videos into themed compilations, long videos that are great for sleeping or drawing. And second, my wonderful patrons who get tons of extra content exclusive to Patreon. We're currently in the middle of season 2 of our BoJack Horseman audio commentaries. Check those out if they interest you. Thank you so much for your support. I couldn't do it without viewers like you. All right, back to Invincible. Okay, let's just start with exactly what makes this character so controversial, because it mostly boils down to one important event in the show, when Mark and Amber were at Upstate University towards the end of season 1. And I do get it. To have Amber show this much anger towards Mark for disappearing, only to reveal that she actually had already figured out he was a superhero and knew that he was fighting these cyborg zombies to protect her, it comes across as a little heartless and ungrateful. I think it was a miscalculation in the writing process, and it's without a doubt the thing that turned the audience against her. I wish they had played out these specific events slightly differently, because the truth is that though she overreacted in this moment, Amber absolutely has many reasons to be upset with Mark as a boyfriend. The problem was never that Mark is a superhero. The problem was that Mark's perpetual absence as a boyfriend stems from the fact that he is a superhero, and this was something he wasn't willing to reveal to her until it was his only option. So not only was Mark just never there for Amber, he was constantly lying about why he was never there for her. There are so many videos about Amber making her out to be actually evil, and when I see these claims, I truly wonder if we watch the same show. Yeah, she's a teenage girl who in one particular moment made a very rash and frustrating decision, but this also came after months of being pretty poorly treated by Mark as a girlfriend. Let's lay out all of the biggest incidents in the Mark and Amber relationship leading up to the big moment that really made people turn on her, because to me, when you look at the entirety of her actions across the season, she's mostly very consistent in stating what she needs from Mark in their relationship. It all basically starts with their first study date. William gives Mark a bunch of Amber's favorite books to read and show his interest, but Mark takes a more direct and genuine approach.
This is more me.
An honest man. I like that.
Literally, on their first ever study date, Amber very explicitly says that she values Mark's honesty. Unfortunately, due to his secret superhero life, honesty does not end up being Mark's strong suit in the relationship. He literally ends up ditching Amber in the middle of this first date to stop an attack, leaving her alone for an hour without any honest explanation. And this is just the first sign of what will end up being the biggest issue in their relationship throughout season 1. And I'm not sure how anyone can defend Mark as a boyfriend watching the events of this season unfold. And to be clear, I'm not saying you can't defend Mark as a person or hero, because ultimately his superhero responsibilities are massively important on an ethical level. The problem is that he is literally stringing this girl along promising he can be there for her when the reality is clear that he absolutely cannot be. Because Mark did not disclose his superhero identity, he has to lie to Amber constantly, even about simple things, like when he tells her that he went to Mount Everest with his dad.
That's unbelievable. How did you like Nepal? Or did you go through China?
And despite these hiccups, their dates do end up going well, but then Mark has to immediately leave to go to Mars on a mission for weeks, which he of course has to lie about.
You're what?
Volunteering. Just like you. I'm going away and helping people for 2 weeks.
And then when he gets back, he can't actually share anything meaningful about his trip with her.
But I did actually help people. Not sure how grateful they were, but whatever.
Huh. That is a strangely non-specific story.
These moments might seem like small things, but this is a microcosm of a bigger issue. These things add up. Mark is not able or willing to share his real self with Amber because of his superhero identity. He can't be honest with her. He can't express his real fears or anxieties about his life. He can't truly be there for her. In fact, there is almost never a single promise that Mark manages to keep in regards to Amber over the course of this season. Whether that's something relatively small, like showing up 20 minutes late to something, something with a bad excuse about Japanese cheesecake, or something big like making it to dinner to meet her mom for the first time. And honestly, this is a huge moment that I think people really overlook.
I have these family responsibilities.
Sure, that's fine. Then make that choice. But then this? I'm not doing this anymore.
This is Amber giving Mark an out, saying, hey, if you have other responsibilities and you can't fit me into your life, that's fine, but you need to make that decision. You can't keep telling me that you'll be there for me and then not be there for me. And I don't know how anyone can see this as anything less than completely fucking reasonable. But despite this opportunity for an out, or to tell Amber the truth, Mark just kind of meekly goes with this line.
I'm gonna do better, I promise.
Which, as I'm sure you might remember, is another promise that he cannot keep. To make it up to her, he promises that he'll be at the soup kitchen to volunteer with her, which is not just a date or a dinner, it's another example of Amber really trying to let Mark in on her life, the things she does with her time that are important to her, insight into her life, something that, because of his secret superhero life, Mark cannot reciprocate. And of course, because of those superhero responsibilities, Mark once again can't keep his promise, and he nearly dies in the process. I think people sort of framing this entire issue as who is right, who is wrong, who is good, who is bad, is pretty blatantly missing the nuances of this show. Even outside of the specific subplot, this is a narrative about how messy life can get when you also have these kinds of superhero level issues and responsibilities to deal with on top of your everyday life. People try to boil it down to a black and white moral question, but this show often lives in those morally gray areas, and that is where the drama stems from. People look at Amber's frustrations with Mark and make the assumption that she wants Mark to ignore his superhero responsibilities and prioritize his relationship with her, which is simply not what the show is remotely implying. The reality is that even if Amber had suspected or figured out that Mark was a superhero by this point, Mark had not shared anything about that life with Amber. She only has the vaguest notion of what that might entail. There are countless different levels of superheroes, and within this world, Amber is not close to any of it. All she knows is that Mark has continuously promised that he could be there for her, that he can make it work and do better even after blowing it over and over, but has not kept that promise even once. Amber wants an honest boyfriend who can keep his promises. If your significant other told you over and over again that they would make dinners or be at dates or join you for important responsibilities and then just didn't show up, you would be upset, even if you suspected that they might have a good reason to not show up. The problem is that Mark repeatedly promises that he can make time in his life for Amber, and he cannot keep that promise, or even give her an honest excuse because he hasn't let her in on the realities of what his life entails. This is a relatively common concept in superhero stories, but for comparison's sake, let's look at the Spider-Man Raimi trilogy. I think this is a really good example of the Spider-Man dilemma. Throughout those first two films in particular, Peter's social life suffers greatly because of his responsibilities as Spider-Man. He literally rejects Mary Jane at the end of the first film, the girl he has always been in love with, because he realizes two things. One, that as long as being Spider-Man is his responsibility, he will struggle to be able to be there for MJ when she needs him. And two, as long as he is Spider-Man, he'll always have enemies who could harm her. This plays out further in Spider-Man 2 when Peter finally decides to abandon those responsibilities so that he can make time for MJ. He only feels that he has time to commit when he is no longer Spider-Man. And these are exactly the two major issues we see playing out in Mark and Amber's relationship, except that unlike Peter, Mark is insistent that he actually can be there for Amber and maintain those responsibilities, which obviously, as we have seen, is not true. But I think this also raises another pretty massively important ethical question that does need to be discussed, and that has to do with informed consent for superheroes in relationships. Basically, does a superhero who wants to date someone and intertwine their entire life with somebody else owe that person the truth in regards to the realities of their dual life? Do they owe it to them to tell them not only their identity, but what dangers come with dating a superhero? I think the answer is very clear, but to discuss this idea more in depth, I want to bring in my friend Scott, aka Kaiser from Team 4-Star, to talk about this very concept.
Thanks for having me, Johnny. I've been dying to talk about this since season 1, and you've finally given me a place to let loose. So folks, let's talk about secret identities and informed consent. Informed consent is technically a medical term, referring to a patient's consent to a medical or surgical procedure or to participation in a clinical study after being properly advised of the relevant medical facts and the risks involved, i.e., the consent of a person to a procedure after they've learned all the facts and risks. But to aid in this conversation, I firmly believe we can adopt this term a little more broadly: the consent of a person to a commitment after they've been fully informed of the facts and risks involved. Because I think, for many of us, we all want to know the facts and risks of any commitment we make beforehand. But why am I bringing this up in relation to superhero identities? Well, I'm sure plenty of you are already smart enough to realize where I'm going with this, but to state it plainly, superhero identities are, essentially, antithetical to informed consent. By their very nature, they necessitate a complete obfuscation of key details about their person. Details that, for many superheroes, range from availability to straight-up danger for them and their significant other. Or more simply, superheroes with secret identities cannot be honest about their lives and commitments and the dangers it puts them and their partners in. So, it's a little morally questionable when superheroes decide to date people who don't know they're a superhero. Relationships are inherently built on trust. While everyone is obviously privileged to their personal information at the beginning of any relationship, there is an often unspoken mutual agreement to commitment and honesty. You show up for dates, you don't cheat on them, and you inform them of any baggage you might be carrying. You also don't lie to their face when you, inevitably, fall short. Everybody f***s up. The fuck up is human. Shakespeare said that. But when you explain why, it should be honest. Furthermore, it's important to realize when you know you're gonna fuck up again. Sometimes you just gotta tell them, hey, I've got this other commitment and it's important. And if they can work with that, awesome. If they can't, well, then you have to make a tough decision. For superheroes, though, there's not really much of a decision to be made, is there? Their focus is on saving people, harm reduction. The job comes first. And, like Amber implies numerous times in Season 2, that's a subjectively, morally correct choice. Nobody is out here arguing that superheroes should be resting on their laurels to make their lunch dates. Amber literally never says this, or even implies it in the entire show, despite what a lot of angry, objectively wrong people online say otherwise. But this does mean that superheroes inevitably have to prioritize their job over their relationships, and they can't even be honest about why, which means they either have to withhold information entirely or lie about what they've been up to. So it's either frustratingly imbalanced or outright dishonest, and a healthy relationship cannot be reasonably built that way. And their partners, often civilians, have no clue what they signed up for. They're often left hanging and wanting and worrying, especially if, say, their partner shows up bloodied and bruised more often than is normal and with increasingly questionable explanations. I've seen a lot of arguments, read straw men, saying, so what? You think superheroes should just reveal their secret identity right off the bat to whoever they're dating? That's not reasonable at all. And you're right! Good thing nobody ever said that. Let me set fire to that straw man. Nobody is saying superheroes should automatically reveal their secret identities to people they just started dating. What we're saying, or at least I'm saying, is that it's morally reprehensible to start a relationship with someone you can't be honest with. And it's not just about honesty. Like I said earlier, sometimes it can also be a matter of mortal danger. And to give you the most famous example from all of comic books, let's take a look at 1963's The Amazing Spider-Man issue 121, The Night Gwen Stacy Died. Green Gobbo's made his way up to the top of the George Washington Bridge, and in tow, a barely conscious Gwen Stacy. After learning Spider-Man's true identity, he offers our favorite web-swinger an ultimatum. Either Spider-Man goes away permanently, or Gwen will. Spidey doesn't take kindly to the threat and manages to wallop Goblin. But unfortunately for Spider-Man and Gwen, the Emerald Asshole still manages to knock Gwen off the bridge. And though he does catch her, Peter's attempts to save Gwen end up breaking her neck, ending her life. Now, this story was shocking to readers at the time, and really emphasized the dynamic of having a secret identity and why superheroes keep those identities to themselves. They don't want other people knowing because that information then makes them a target. But here's a particularly dark fact to consider about Gwen Stacy's untimely demise. She didn't know. She died not knowing Peter Parker was Spider-Man. I mean, this was retconned in the Clone Conspiracy in 2016, but even there, she only knew after Peter showed up to save her. She had no clue she was dating New York's finest, but Goblin did, and he wasted little time leveraging that to hurt Peter, something that would haunt him for years after. And frankly, for good reason, because it never really mattered whether or not she knew. As long as the villains found out another way, she'd unknowingly have a target on her back, which is exactly what happened. And worst of all, she never had the chance to make that choice. Gwen Stacy never had the chance to decide whether or not she would be under threat, to have that target on her. Peter made that decision for her, without her knowledge. That's not hyperbole, that's what happened. And while we don't hate Peter for it, nor do I think we should, it highlights the significant power imbalance inherent in relationships between civilians and superheroes, where one side is significantly more powerful and informed, while the other side is uninformed and unprepared. And to use Invincible to put a period on my point, remember this scene? It's terrifying. a Viltrumite has appeared out of nowhere, hand around Amber's neck, threatening her life if Mark does not acquiesce to her demands. Mark does so, saving Amber's life, but ultimately putting the final nail in the, frankly already buried, coffin that was their relationship. But consider this for me, if you would. What if Amber didn't know? Consider an alternate universe where she never found out Mark was a superhero, and Anissa still showed up, threatening her life. In the show, she at least knew Mark was a superhero by this point. When they break up, she's obviously frustrated, but at the circumstances, not Mark. But imagine if she didn't know when Anissa showed up. How up would it be to suddenly be in danger, mortal danger, because your partner is a superhero and you never knew? You never got to make that choice. They made it for you, and now you might die. This is why a lot of superheroes in these stories end up dating other superheroes. Hell, it's a huge factor in Invincible and Adam Eve inevitably hooking up. I assume. I haven't read past this, but they're telegraphing it pretty hard. Superheroes know the stakes and are more well equipped to handle each other's secret identity, and you can obviously still make civvy romances work. I mean, Lois Lane was in love with Superman first. She was ride or die with his lifestyle way before she found out her coworker could take off his glasses. People tend to hand-wave the moral complexities of this subject because superheroes are often, frankly, fantasy. Power fantasies about being strong, fast, invincible. About being able to stop bad guys and or just make the world a generally better place. They're ways for us to imagine a better version of ourselves, to both inspire us and give us hope. So when they're told that it might be morally reprehensible for superheroes to have relationships with people who don't know the whole story, some people get defensive. And I completely understand that. We want our romanticized superhero stories, thank you very much. And we don't want to feel conflicted about the complicated decisions our heroes make for the sake of the greater good. And that's fine. But Invincible lives in that uncomfortable place. It's subversive, explorative, and one might even use the word deconstructive at points. While it absolutely is and excels at being a superhero story, it wants to explore those complicated issues. And while people are usually fine with the moral complexity of Invincible, I genuinely think a lot of people missed that his relationship with Amber is part of that. None of this is meant as a systemic rebuke of superhero romance, but I think it is important that when superhero media does explore these complexities, we try to meet them on their terms, especially when we're willing to do so with other subjects. And remember, folks, if you're consenting without knowing all of the risks, is that really consent?
Thank you, Scott. Obviously, he touched on one of the most harrowing events of Season 2 when Anissa threatens Amber, and honestly, I think Season 2, for the most part, does a pretty amazing job playing out Mark and Amber's relationship in a nuanced and emotional way post-Season 1. Now, after the events of Season 1, having a full picture of the reality of Mark's life as a superhero, and getting the transparency and honesty from Mark that she was missing in Season 1, Amber is much more open and understanding about Mark's dual life. He isn't just not showing up for important milestones with her, he isn't giving her bullshit excuses. He's being open and communicating what he's doing, why he can't be there when he's absent, opening up about the insane complexities of his superhero life. I talk about aspects of this in my last Invincible video about Mark and Nolan's inverted arcs, but Mark's absolute commitment to trying everything he can to make his relationship with Amber work is so important to his story arc in Season 2. Mark is desperate to maintain his connection to his home planet, to maintain his humanity, basically to prove to the world and to himself that he is not like his father. And trying to live a normal college life with his girlfriend is kind of the epitome of this. But it quickly becomes clear that any semblance of a normal college life with Amber isn't really possible. After arriving at school, he immediately has to go to space and ends up off planet for months, which isn't just difficult because of the time apart, but makes Amber's life needlessly complicated back at school too. Even just having to explain to her friends and classmates where Mark is all the time. Not really having anybody to actually talk about the fears and anxieties that come with dating a superhero who disappears for months. Or having a boyfriend who is mysteriously absent when major life events occur, like her grandfather dying.
You know, people asked where you were. Having to lie about it wasn't awesome.
Perhaps even more painful is just the recognition from Amber that she's not only not getting what she needs out of the relationship most of the time, but feels bad about it on the rare occasions where she is getting what she needs from the relationship.
When we're together, I feel guilty. Like I'm taking him away from people who really need him.
I think that some people look at this in a simpler, more black and white way than they should, as though Amber should not possibly be allowed to be upset when Mark is helping people because he's a hero working for the greater good. But that is specifically the gray area the show lives in, how difficult it would be to know the person you love is needed more elsewhere, even when you also need them. And it's really hard for these literal teenagers to cope with the fact that they cannot be the people they need for each other.
Mark needs someone who
Is there for her. who really understands what she's going through in college.
I know some people think the relationship felt drawn out or like they should have ended it here, but I think this sort of throws out the importance of Mark's arc and motivation in this season. This is realistically the point in which they maybe should have realized their lives simply aren't compatible. Mark isn't able to make the space in his life for Amber, and Amber isn't able to get what she needs out of a relationship from Mark. But Mark is so committed to not being like his father, he doesn't want to give up his connections to Earth, the things that make him human. His relationship with Amber is more than just his relationship. It represents something larger within his life, something that will shape the kind of future he thinks he can have. And it's why, even though all logic may have said, okay, this should probably end here, I found it so beautifully impactful that Mark desperately tried one last time to make it work. Mark makes major concessions in his superhero life to put in the time he needs with Amber.
And I made a deal with Cecil to guarantee me 2 nights a week off going forward.
And these desperate last-ditch effort attempts to make it work are what makes the grim reality all the more devastating. The realization that even if he's able to concede this time from his responsibilities and commit it to Amber, they still can't have a normal relationship, not as long as people are trying to harm him. She will always be in danger. Look, I don't think Mark and Amber were meant to be together. They're each other's first loves. What works about this is that it's an exaggerated look at how actual young relationships often come to an end, when they realize that the direction their lives are going are not compatible. It's just made all the more difficult by the fact that this is a super-powered world.
I have no agency, Mark. Who am I to be upset or sad or feel anything when you're literally saving the world?
The pain Mark feels over the loss of this relationship is more than just Amber. It's the possibility of a specific type of future that he dreamed for himself. It's a life-altering realization. And I don't know how you can watch this scene and not feel heartbreak. It's really, really sad, and it beautifully ties into the larger themes behind this season. I don't think every aspect of this relationship was executed perfectly, but Amber Bennett absolutely gets far more hate than is warranted. Ultimately, they told a nuanced story that was willing to dive into the nitty-gritty emotional difficulties that come with this kind of superhero relationship in a way that many other stories aren't willing to do, and it's just one of the reasons that I love Invincible.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.